Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 492, Rule of Three. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by its listeners. Many thanks and much gratefulness to all of the listeners who have gone over to patreon.com/craftlit and pledged their support to the show. We couldn't do it without you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am fine. I am getting ready for Scotland and just wanted to give you a heads up. I'm going to do my very best to get episodes out next week, but next week is also graduation and then leaving right after for Scotland. So I'm not really sure how the next 2 weeks are going to pan out, but my goal is certainly to get you another chapter of Anne of Green Gables and Room with View before I take off. The week of the tour, there won't be anything. I haven't been able to get stuff into the queue for you fast enough, so I apologize for that. But I have a voicemail from Jana Lee before we get into our chapter today, because it's one of my favorite chapters, and I think I am correct in saying it is also one of Kim's favorites, so we have a good one. But first, Jana Lee. Here she is.
Hi, Heather. This is Jana Lee, Knits and Hikes on Ravelry. It's taken me a little while to catch up with Anne of Green Gables, and I'm just starting that story, but I wanted to call in and tell you or answer your question about why or how I fell in love with Anne Shirley. I read a lot as a little girl, and I don't remember the first time that I read the Anne of Green Gables book, but I do remember that I read the first one a couple of times before I discovered that there was a sequel and then that there were multiple sequels after that. And my mom actually owned eventually all of those books and several other ones by Lucy Maud Montgomery. And so I've read quite a few of her books. And as a child, I remember loving the fact that Anne had red hair and freckles, because so did I. And I remember loving the fact that she was so imaginative, because so was I. I loved to read books, and I loved to think about things, and I loved to imagine. And Anne just felt like such a kindred spirit to me. But listening to it with you this time, I hope I don't get choked up, I was realizing what a little child she is. I believe the last time that I read through the series, it was before my oldest son was born, so it's been about 20 years. And coming to it as a parent is such a different experience than coming to it as a child. I look at Marilla and I'm kind of astonished at her patience and her humor and her thoughtfulness in reacting to the things that Anne brings into her life. And I'm just tickled by Matthew all over again about his love and complete understanding and admiration of Anne. But listening to Anne on the way home with Matthew and then speaking with Marilla later and then in the third and fourth chapters, I couldn't help but be teary-eyed and choked up because of the feeling that she's suddenly such a relief, and all of this words comes out of her mouth, and Marilla and Matthew are both a little astonished at how much she's speaking. And I think some of that might be relief that she's finally in a place where people want her. She can relax, she can feel safe. And I've seen that with my kids as we would experience something and then we'd be home or we'd be in the car and they'd be in a safe spot, and all of a sudden all of this information would come out that I wasn't expecting to hear. And I would have to take a little bit, and I was not always as patient as Marilla or Matthew with Anne. So I think that's something for me to take away. But I'm so glad that we're reading this book, and I'm so appreciative of the reader and of your commenting and the other people that have called in. And I can't wait to catch up, and I'll have to wait for more. So anyway, it's a double-edged sword that is being behind. But thank you. Bye.
So, Jana Lee, I have to tell you that when I was recording for Chapter 8, where we learned that Anne, when she was at Mrs. Thomas's with the drunk husband and the tree fell on him, when she was at Miss Thomas's and had the friend, Katie Maurice, in the window of the glass cabinet, it took me so many takes to record that section talking about how young she is and what a rough go of it she has had. So I totally understand how reading this as an adult is probably a very, very different experience from reading it as a small redheaded child. Yay, you. So today's chapter is a lot of fun, and there isn't a whole lot of extra craziness in it, but there are a couple of interesting things. One thing you've probably, if you don't live someplace that gets muddy, you might not have heard about this before, but a bootjack is it's like a pry bar tool that you can use to help you get boots off your feet. And I have a picture to one in the show notes at craftlit.com/492. It also might be helpful to know that buying clothes when Anne of Green Gables was being written was not the same as it is now. You couldn't just go and get something off the rack. People had to make them, and people had to make them by hand. There were sewing machines. They were probably not ubiquitous on Prince Edward Island. So when people talk about making clothes, they are talking about stitching it by hand. Thus the importance of being able to make a straight seam and stitch tiny stitches that are not going to come out. These things were important. So that's one. Two, Gloria, lowercase g, Loria. That is a fabric. It's a very, very tight weave, a close weave. It could be silk. It is also often cotton, but it's woven tightly enough together that it has a nice, not necessarily a sheen to it, but it's going to look like a serious piece of cloth and not a flour bag, is what I'm trying to say. Shearing, Shirring, a little bit like smocking, although smocking I think is usually done with embroidery stitches. Shearing is gathering together lots of tiny, tiny, tiny little gathers, little tiny, tiny pleats, so that you could make, it looks like what we would do with elastic now, but you could do it with just stitches and bring all of the voluminous amounts of fabric into make something a little bit more close fitting where you want it to be, like around the wrists or around your waist, that kind of thing. But of course, again, doing that without a sewing machine would be a laborious process, not to be undertaken by the faint of heart. And the last thing before we listen is an Ulster coat. We've come across this before. An Ulster coat made famous by Ulster in Ireland. This kind of coat was worn there. And when I went looking for information on it, just looking for fabric and things like that, I found a website called the Gentleman's Gazette. And there is an entire article on the Ulster coat. According to the Gentleman's Gazette, there are, I think, 7 things that have to occur for you to have a true Ulster. 1, it has to be long and double-breasted with 2 vertical parallel rows of buttons. Okay. Notched lapels. Usually, a double-breasted garment has peaked lapels. The Ulster, however, has lapels that are notched in a certain way so that they can easily be folded over when the coat is buttoned up all the way. This is also known as an Ulster collar. It should have patch pockets in order to express the informal country character of the overcoat. The Ulster always has patch pockets. Contrasting stitching. For the same reason, an Ulster shows contrast stitching along the edges and cuffs. Cuffs. You will always see cuffs on a true Ulster. The Ulster is usually cut rather generously, and that is one of the reasons why you will hear it mentioned today. And so because of that, it could look a little bulky depending on what you're wearing it over. So in order to give the silhouette a little bit more shape, the Ulster usually has a belted back, a half belt with adjustable buttons. You've seen this before, right? So that the wearer can change the amount of waist suppression in the back, not messing up the double-breastedness in the front. Tweed. A genuine Ulster is made out of tweed, more specifically Donegal tweed. Now, this, I have to say, I have found varying opinions on this. Another couple of places said it was made out of Irish frieze, Frieze, I think that's how it's spelled, which is a heavily woven fabric, and one side of that fabric is brushed hard with a hard brush, raising a nap, raising like a fuzzy edge to it, which I think would help with keeping water out. So I don't know about the tweed part. I'm not going to guarantee that. And then the last is an optional option, which is a hood or a cape. In the 1880s, Ulster overcoats often had a hood or cape or a pelerine. Many people associate the cape as worn by Sherlock Holmes with the Ulster coat. So that's the over cape over the shoulders. And however, while those are indeed things that you can put on Ulster overcoats, a hood or cape is not essential to its classification. There you go. And with that, let's go listen to the literary stylings of Kim for Chapter 25 of Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery.
Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery, read by Kim Zuckert. Chapter 25, Matthew insists on puffed sleeves. Matthew was having a bad 10 minutes of it. He had come into the kitchen in the twilight of a cold, grey December evening, and had sat down in the woodbox corner to take off his heavy boots, unconscious of the fact that Anne and a bevy of her schoolmates were having a practice of the Fairy Queen in the sitting-room. Presently they came trooping through the hall and out into the kitchen, laughing and chattering gaily. They did not see Matthew, who shrank bashfully back into the shadows beyond the woodblock with a boot in one hand and a bootjack in the other, and he watched them shyly for the aforesaid 10 minutes, as they put on caps and jackets and talked about the dialogue and the concert. Anne stood among them, bright-eyed and animated as they, but Matthew suddenly became conscious that there was something about her different from her mates. And what worried Matthew was that the difference impressed him as being something that should not exist. Anne had a brighter face and bigger, starrier eyes and more delicate features than the other. Even shy, unobservant Matthew had learned to take note of these things. But the difference that disturbed him did not consist in any of these respects. Then in what did it consist? Matthew was haunted by this question long after the girls had gone, arm in arm, down the long, hard-frozen lane, and Anne had betaken herself to her books. He could not refer it to Marilla, who, he felt, would be quite sure to sniff scornfully and remark that the only difference she saw between Anne and the other girls was that they sometimes kept their tongues quiet, while Anne never did. This, Matthew felt, would be no great help. He had recourse to his pipe that evening to help him study it out, much to Marilla's disgust. After 2 hours of smoking and hard reflection, Matthew arrived at a solution of his problem. Anne was not dressed like the other girls. The more Matthew thought about the matter, the more he was convinced that Anne never had been dressed like the other girls, never, since she had come to Green Gables. Marilla kept her clothed in plain dark dresses, all made after the same unvarying pattern. If Matthew knew there was such a thing as fashion in dress, it was as much as he did, but he was quite sure that Anne's sleeves did not look at all like the sleeves the other girls wore. He recalled the cluster of little girls he had seen around her that evening, all gay in waists of red and blue and pink and white, and he wondered why Marilla always kept her so plainly and soberly gowned. Of course it must be all right. Marilla knew best, and Marilla was bringing her up. Probably some wise, inscrutable motive was to be served thereby. But surely it would do no harm to let the child have one pretty dress, something like Diana Barry always wore. Matthew decided that he would give her one. That surely could not be objected to as an unwarranted putting in of his oar. Christmas was only a fortnight off. A nice new dress would be the very thing for a present. Matthew, with a sigh of satisfaction, put away his pipe and went to bed, while Marilla opened all the doors and aired the house. The very next evening Matthew betook himself to Carmody to buy the dress, determined to get the worst over and have done with it. It would be, he felt assured, no trifling ordeal. There were some things Matthew could buy and prove himself no mean bargainer, but he knew he would be at the mercy of shopkeepers when it came to buying a girl's dress. After much cogitation, Matthew resolved to go to Samuel Lawson's store instead of William Blair's. To be sure, the Cuthberts always had gone to William Blair's. It was almost as much a matter of conscience with them as to attend the Presbyterian church and vote Conservative. But William Blair's 2 daughters frequently waited on customers there, and Matthew held them in absolute dread. He could contrive to deal with them when he knew exactly what he wanted and could point it out. But in such a matter as this, requiring explanation and consultation, Matthew felt that he must be sure of a man behind the counter, so he would go to Lawson's, where Samuel or his son would wait on him. Alas, Matthew did not know that Samuel, in the recent expansion of his business, had set up a lady clerk also. She was a niece of his wife's, and a very dashing young person indeed, with a huge, drooping pompadour, big, rolling brown eyes, and a most extensive and bewildering smile. She was dressed with exceeding smartness, and wore several bangle bracelets that glittered and rattled and tinkled with every movement of her hands. Matthew was covered with confusion at finding her there at all, and those bangles completely wrecked his wits at one fell swoop. "What can I do for you this evening, Mr. Cuthbert?" Miss Lucilla Harris inquired, briskly and ingratiatingly tapping the counter with both hands. "Have you any, well now, say, any garden rakes?" stammered Matthew. Miss Harris looked somewhat surprised, as well she might, to hear a man inquiring for garden rakes in the middle of December. "I believe we have one or two left over," she said, "but they're upstairs in the lumber room. I'll go and see." During her absence, Matthew collected his scattered senses for another effort. When Miss Harris returned with the rake and cheerfully inquired, "Anything else tonight, Mr. Cuthbert?" Matthew took his courage in both hands and replied, "Well now, since you suggest it, I might as well buy some hayseed." Miss Harris had heard Matthew Cuthbert called odd. She now concluded that he was entirely crazy. "We only keep hayseed in the spring," she explained loftily. "We have none on hand just now." "Oh, certainly, just as you say," stammered unhappy Matthew, seizing the rake and making for the door. At the threshold he recollected that he had not paid for it, and he turned miserably back. While Miss Harris was counting out his change, he rallied his powers for a final desperate attempt. "Well now, if it isn't too much trouble, I might as well, that is, I'd like to look at some sugar." "White or brown?" queried Miss Harris, patiently. "Oh, well now, brown," said Matthew, feebly. "There's a barrel of it over there," said Miss Harris, shaking her bangles at it. "It's the only kind we have." I'll take 20 pounds of it," said Matthew, with beads of perspiration standing on his forehead. Matthew had driven halfway home before he was his own man again. It had been a gruesome experience, but it served him right, he thought, for committing the heresy of going to a strange store. When he reached home, he hid the rake in the tool house, but the sugar he carried into Marilla. "Brown sugar?" exclaimed Marilla. "Whatever possessed you to get so much? You know I never use it except for the hired man's porridge or black fruit cake. Jerry's gone, and I've made my cake long ago. It's not good sugar either. It's coarse and dark. William Blair doesn't usually keep sugar like that." I thought it might come in handy sometime," said Matthew, making good his escape. When Matthew came to think the matter over, he decided that a woman was required to cope with the situation. Marilla was out of the question. Matthew felt sure she would throw cold water on his project at once. Remained only Mrs. Lynde, for of no other woman in Avonlea would Matthew have dared to ask advice. To Mrs. Lynde he went accordingly, and that good lady promptly took the matter out of the harassed man's hands. "Pick out a dress for you to give Anne? To be sure I will. I'm going to Carmody tomorrow, and I'll attend to it. Have you got something particular in mind? No? Well, I'll just go by my own judgment, then. I believe a nice, rich brown would just suit Anne, and William Blair's some new Gloria in that's real pretty. Perhaps you'd like me to make it up for her, too, seeing that if Marilla was to make it, Anne would probably get wind of it before time and spoil the surprise. Well, I'll do it. No, it isn't a mite of trouble. I like sewing. I'll make it to fit my niece, Jenny Gillis, for she and Anne are as like as two peas as far as figure goes." "Well, now, I'm much obliged," said Matthew, and I don't know, but I think they make the sleeves different nowadays to what they used to be. If it wouldn't be asking too much, I'd like them made in the new way." "Puffs? Of course. You needn't worry a speck more about it, Matthew. I'll make it up in the very latest fashion," said Mrs. Lynde. To herself, she added, when Matthew had gone, "It'll be a real satisfaction to see that poor child wearing something decent for once. The way Marilla dresses her is positively ridiculous, that's what, and I've ached to tell her so plainly a dozen times. I've held my tongue, though, for I can see Marilla doesn't want advice, and she thinks she knows more about bringing children up than I do, for all she's an old maid. But that's always the way. Folks that has brought up children know there's no hard and fast method in the world that'll suit every child. But them as never have think it's all as plain and easy as rule of three. Just set your 3 terms down so fashion and the sum will work out correct. But flesh and blood don't come under the head of arithmetic, and that's where Marilla Cuthbert makes her mistake. I suppose she's trying to cultivate a spirit of humility to Anne by dressing her as she does, but it's more likely to cultivate envy and discontent. I'm sure the child must feel the difference between her clothes and the other girls. But to think of Matthew taking notice of it! That man is waking up after being asleep for over 60 years. Marilla knew all the following fortnight that Matthew had something on his mind, but what it was she could not guess, until Christmas Eve, when Mrs. Lynde brought up the new dress. Marilla behaved pretty well on the whole, although it is very likely she distrusted Mrs. Lynde's diplomatic explanation that she had made the dress because Matthew was afraid Anne would find out about it too soon if Marilla made it. "So this is what Matthew's been looking so mysterious over and grinning about to himself for 2 weeks, is it?" she said, a little stiffly but tolerantly. "I knew he was up to some foolishness. Well, I must say I don't think Anne needed any more dresses. I made her 3 good, warm, serviceable ones this fall, and anything more is sheer extravagance. There's enough material in those sleeves alone to make a waist, I declare there is. You'll just pamper Anne's vanity, Matthew, and she's as vain as a peacock now. Well, I suppose she'll be satisfied at last, for I know she's been hankering after those silly sleeves ever since they came in, although she's never said a word after the first. The puffs have been getting bigger and more ridiculous right along. They're as big as balloons now. Next year, anybody who wears them will have to go through a door sideways." Christmas morning broke on a beautiful white world. It had been a very mild December, and people had looked forward to a green Christmas, but just enough snow fell softly in the night to transfigure Avonlea. Anne peeped out from her frosted gable window with delighted eyes. The firs in the haunted wood were all feathery and wonderful. The birches and wild cherry trees were outlined in pearl. The ploughed fields were stretches of snowy dimples, and there was a crisp tang in the air that was glorious. Anne ran downstairs singing until her voice re-echoed through Green Gables. "Merry Christmas, Marilla! Merry Christmas, Matthew! Isn't it a lovely Christmas? I'm so glad it's white. Any other kind of Christmas doesn't seem real, does it? I don't like green Christmases. They're not green. They're just nasty, faded browns and grays. What makes people call them green? What, Matthew? Is that for me? Oh, Matthew!" Matthew had sheepishly unfolded the dress from its paper swathings and held it out with a deprecatory glance at Marilla, who feigned to be contemptuously filling the teapot, but nevertheless watched the scene out of the corner of her eye with a rather interested air. Anne took the dress and looked at it in reverent silence. Oh, how pretty it was! A lovely, soft brown gloria with all the gloss of silk, a skirt with dainty frills and shirrings, a waist elaborately pin-tucked in the most fashionable way, with a little ruffle of filmy lace at the neck. But the sleeves! They were the crowning glory. Long elbow cuffs, and above them 2 beautiful puffs, divided by rows of shirring and bows of brown silk ribbon. "That's a Christmas present for you, Anne," said Matthew shyly. Why, Anne, don't you like it?" Well now. For Anne's eyes had suddenly filled with tears. "Like it? Oh, Matthew!" Anne laid the dress over a chair and clasped her hands. "Matthew, it's perfectly exquisite. Oh, I can never thank you enough. Look at those sleeves. Oh, it seems to me this must be a happy dream." Well, let's have breakfast," interrupted Marilla. "I must say, Anne, I don't think you needed this dress, but since Matthew has got it for you, see that you take good care of it. There's a hair ribbon Mrs. Lynde left for you. It's brown to match the dress. Come now, sit in." "I don't see how I'm going to eat breakfast," said Anne rapturously. breakfast seems so commonplace at such an exciting moment. I'd rather feast my eyes on that dress. I'm so glad that puff sleeves are still fashionable. It did seem to me that I'd never get over it if they went out before I had a dress with them. I'd never have felt quite satisfied, you see. Oh, it was lovely of Mrs. Lynde to give me the ribbon, too. I feel like I ought to be a very good girl indeed. It's at times like this I'm sorry I'm not a model little girl, and I always resolve that I will be in future. But somehow it's hard to carry out your resolutions when irresistible temptations come. Still, I really will make an extra effort after this. When the commonplace breakfast was over, Diana appeared, crossing the white log bridge in the hollow, a gay little figure in her crimson ulster. Anne flew down the slope to meet her. "Merry Christmas, Diana! And oh, it's a wonderful Christmas! I've something splendid to show you. Matthew has given me the loveliest dress with such sleeves. I couldn't even imagine any nicer." "I've got something more for you," said Diana breathlessly. "Here, this box. Aunt Josephine sent us out a big box with ever so many things in it, and this is for you. I'd have brought it over last night, but it didn't come until after dark, and I never feel very comfortable coming through the haunted wood in the dark now." Anne opened the box and peeped in. First a card with "For the Anne girl" and "Merry Christmas" written on it, and then a pair of the daintiest little kid slippers with beaded toes and satin bows and glistening buckles. "Oh," said Anne, "Diana, this is too much. I must be dreaming." "I call it providential," said Diana. "You won't have to borrow Ruby's slippers now, and that's a blessing, for they're 2 sizes too big for you, and it would be awful to hear a fairy shuffling. Josie Pye would be delighted. Mind you, Rob Wright went home with Gertie Pye from the practice night before last. Did you ever hear anything equal to that?" All the Avonlea scholars were in a fever of excitement that day, for the hall had to be decorated, and a last grand rehearsal held. The concert came off in the evening and was a pronounced success. The little hall was crowded. All the performers did excellently well, but Anne was the bright particular star of the occasion, as even envy, in the shape of Josie Pye, dared not deny. "Oh, hasn't it been a brilliant evening?" sighed Anne, when it was all over and she and Diana were walking home together under a dark, starry sky. "Everything went off very well," said Diana practically. "I guess we must have made as much as $10. Mind you, Mr. Allen is going to send an account of it to the Charlottetown papers." "Oh, Diana, will we really see our names in print? It makes me thrill to think of it. Your solo was perfectly elegant, Diana. I felt prouder than you did when it was encored. I just said to myself, it is my dear bosom friend who is so honored." "Well, your recitations just brought down the house, Anne. That sad one was simply splendid." "Oh, I was so nervous, Diana. When Mr. Allen called out my name, I really cannot tell how I ever got up on that platform. I felt as if a million eyes were looking at me and through me, and for one dreadful moment I was sure I couldn't begin at all. Then I thought of my lovely puffed sleeves and took courage. I knew that I must live up to those sleeves, Diana. So I started in, and my voice seemed to be coming from ever so far away. I just felt like a parrot. It's providential that I practiced those recitations so often up in the garret, or I'd never have been able to get it through. Did I groan all right?" "Yes, indeed, you groaned lovely," assured Diana. "I saw old Mrs. Sloane wiping away tears when I sat down. It was splendid to think I had touched somebody's heart. It's so romantic to take part in a concert, isn't it? Oh, it's been a very memorable occasion indeed." "Wasn't the boys' dialogue fine?" said Diana. "Gilbert Blythe was just splendid." "And I do think it's awful mean the way you treat Gil. Wait till I tell you. When you ran off the platform after the fairy dialogue, one of your roses fell out of your hair. I saw Gil pick it up and put it in his breast pocket. There now, you're so romantic that I'm sure you ought to be pleased at that." "It's nothing to me what that person does," said Anne loftily. "I simply never waste a thought on him, Diana." That night Marilla and Matthew, who had been out to a concert for the first time in 20 years, sat for a while by the kitchen fire after Anne had gone to bed. "Well now, I guess our Anne did as well as any of them," said Matthew proudly. "Yes, she did," admitted Marilla. "She's a bright child, Matthew, and she looked real nice, too. I've been kind of opposed to this concert scheme, but I suppose there's no real harm in it after all. Anyhow, I was proud of Anne tonight, though I'm not going to tell her so." "Well, now, I was proud of her, and I did tell her so before she went upstairs," said Matthew. "We must see what we can do for her some of these days, Marilla. I guess she'll need something more than Avonlea School by and by." "There's time enough to think of that," said Marilla. "She's only 13 in March, though tonight it struck me that she was growing quite a big girl. Mrs. Lynde made that dress a mite too long, and it makes Anne look so tall. She's quick to learn, and I guess the best thing we can do for her will be to send her to Queen's after a spell. But nothing need to be said about that for a year or two yet." "Well, now, it'll do no harm to be thinking it over off and on," said Matthew. "Things like that are all the better for lots of thinking over." End of chapter 25.
Okay, tell me you didn't tear up when Anne did. Seriously. Not even a little mushy? Oh, yay, Matthew. What a mensch. This guy, if you didn't love Matthew before, you gotta love Matthew now. And Miss Rachel Lynde, hello. Really volunteering to sew the dress, and so quickly and so beautifully, and making such lovely choices because Anne's fire red hair is going to look so good against a rich brown, and not one but 2 sets of puffs on her arm. Whoa, 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 whoa. Amazing. And she didn't just stop there. She added the frills and the little fiddly bits and the shirring and all of that stuff. So, sure, we can be annoyed by her, but she's a mensch too. Now, in Marilla's defense, there may be another factor, and we will learn more about this possibility as we move on. I don't think it was ever directly stated this way later in the book, but there are some hints that we get. We know Marilla is really good in the kitchen. And not only can she make wine, she can make cordial, which, by the way, was like a medicinal thing, cord, C-O-R, for heart. It was thought that it was supposed to help your heart to have cordial every once in a while. But Marilla can clearly find her way around a kitchen. She is not such a handy needle worker. So when she has made these serviceable clothes for Anne, it is very possible that some of that is just because she hates sewing and isn't particularly good at it, and so she is making the most simple dress she can get away with. And while we don't get a lot of physical description of Marilla, I think we can probably say without fear of being contradicted that Marilla is probably dressing herself quite the same as well, because she would have to be making the clothes that she's wearing too. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind about Marilla. There's stuff going on with why she chooses to do some of the things the way that she does. Rule of 3, if you didn't catch it. The rule of 3, the way Rachel Lynde put it so quickly, was you have 3 numbers. You think you lay down 3 rules for the kid, and then you kind of walk away wiping your hands of the whole thing because you are sure that the next thing that will happen will be what you wanted. This all goes back to ratios and working with numbers. And for example, if you're looking at the ratio 3/4 is equivalent to 12/x, and you're supposed to solve for x, you have 3 numbers. Those 3 numbers will allow you to figure out the 4th, which in this case would be 16. And if you want to write that down and figure it out yourself, knock yourself out. We had to do this with Flatland. I don't want to do any more math verbally if I don't have to, but that will give you the idea of what Rachel is calling the rule of 3. So that was it. That was our big, happy, exciting chapter. Anne got her dress with the puffy sleeves, double puffy sleeves. It's like Oreos with double stuff. It's awesome. And to let you go, I have a vaguely adult voicemail for you from Tara. If you are listening with small children, you might want to turn this off and listen to it later when you're by yourself. But you should know that I have a link to what Tara is talking about in the show notes at craftlit.com/492. I very much hope I talk to you next week. And then once I'm back from Scotland, I will be trying to post, as I always try to when I'm on one of the Craftlit tours, I will be trying to post so you can see pictures of where we're going and so that we can share the cool, nifty stuff that we learn about while we're there. And I'm going to let Tara play you out. All right. Have a great one. I'll talk to you soon. Here's Tara.
Hello, Heather. Tara Worcester here, putting away the week's groceries. Anywho, I have a comment on Tableau. If anyone who has a Hulu account has watched the TV series Harlots, you actually see in the rival whorehouse the son of the mistress putting together a tableau with the ladies of the house. And they're dressed in taffeta, which is very light and airy and revealing. And what's the word I'm looking for? Ethereal. There we go. And they do their pose. And look, Mama, it's a tableau of some sort of something. But it's an interesting depiction of what tableau would have been like a la risque. It's interesting to see just how detailed and how extravagant these tableaus could be. And I'm wondering if tableau is part of where miming or charade would be another form of charade, or where it would have come from, for someone who just could not simply keep still or some other such thing. But it was an interesting thing to see them do that on the TV show in a whorehouse. This is really interesting. Again, it's Harlots. It's on Hulu. I want to say there are 2 seasons, and it's really interesting, but there's a lot of fornication in that TV series, so you've been warned. It is very X-rated, so have your fan and your smelling salts if you're of not strong fortification. I hope you're having a great day, Heather. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
A big thanks to all the Craftlit listeners who support the show by being a premium audio member via craftlit.com/premium or via patreon.com/craftlit. Your support for the show is what's kept us going since 2006. If you feel like getting free audio pretty much every week, please consider supporting the show by heading over to patreon.com/craftlit and pledging what you feel the show is worth to you. If you can't support the show that way, consider leaving a review at iTunes or at our facebook.com/craftlit page, or follow @craftlit on Twitter and share the show with your followers too. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.